Hi everyone, welcome back to Ferrigno Freedom Channel. I'm Dante Ferrigno and I'm glad you're here. Today I'm going to be speaking with Peter Vanderplas. Peter Vanderplas reached out to me via the email address that I leave in the description of every video because I want you guys to be able to let me know if you've got something that's worth sharing, some information that we might be able to learn more about the carnivore way of eating, lion diet, and anything else that's going to help us to be healthier, happier people and to be able to overcome some of the barriers that we've had to good health. Now, Peter is an interesting story. Peter is a bicyclist, exercising enthusiast too. Let's see what his website says. Cycling is a time-consuming hobby, so why not use it for a good cause? Together with colleagues from Marin, this summer I will ride from Barcelona, northern Italy, to Maastricht, Netherlands. With this ride, we hope to collect as much funding as possible to support innovative cancer research at Erasmus MC. About me, I am employed at the Maritime Research Institute, Netherlands, that's Marin, located in Wageningen, where we perform model tests and computer simulations of maritime and offshore applications. Outside work hours, I love to cycle. It gives me a welcome distraction from work, but it also helps a lot with controlling my blood glucose levels. I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes about 15 years ago. By finishing the Tour for Life, I like to demonstrate that carbohydrate intake is not required for intensive endurance exercise and that a ketogenic diet poses no impediment. On the contrary, here is some interesting background information about cancer and cancer research he shares on his site. That's perfect because he's calling in right now, and now we can go ahead and switch over to bring him in. When I'm editing, sometimes it's really hard to have time to get up and make something to eat. That's why I love carnivore crisps. I keep a bag handy just in case I get a little hungry so that I don't have to be distracted from my work. I can stop for a moment, have some delicious food that is perfectly on my way of eating, that has been so good for my body and so good for my mind. Beef brisket is my favorite by far of all the carnivore crisps. Get yours at CarnivoreCrisps.com and use my coupon code DANTE, D-A-N-T-E, to save 10% on your order. I hope you love them as much as I do. Hey, Peter. How are you doing today?
Hi. Hello, Dante.
All right. Glad to have you on.
Yeah, I'm happy to join. It's an honor. Yes, I was supposed to be in Italy. Actually, I'm now calling from the Netherlands, from my living room.
Oh,
I
okay.
expected actually to call in front of my bike packing tent, but something sad happened last Friday. I was supposed to get on the bus. You cannot believe it, but I got robbed of my phone and my cards at that place while packing all the things on the bus. So my bike was already loaded in the trailer on the back. My luggage was inside, and then we started looking for my phone and my cards. And of course, I first thought I lost it. And
Man, life is just
these
full
things
of
never
surprises,
happened,
isn't
but
it?
it was some kind of clever thief, really. And well, it's unfortunate, but I'll make some new travel plans. I will certainly not bike over there. So we'll have to find a bus to get there because the trip back is already long enough.
So is this going to impede your plans to do that ride across Europe there?
No, that's
You mentioned that you had past experiences before starting carnivore and that you were a type 1 diabetic. You've been diagnosed now for 15 years as a type 1 diabetic, which is
yes.
interesting because I don't know much about type 1 diabetics, so I'm glad to be able to have somebody come on the channel and illuminate some of the things that surround that and carnivore way of eating. And but I thought it was something that you kind of knew you had since birth. But again, it's something I haven't taken a very close look at. And then we can also get into the benefits that you experienced since switching to a carnivore way of eating.
Yeah. A lot of people think that it's something you get only from birth. There might be some genetics at play, of course, but also a lot of people about other reasons, right? There are ideas about vaccinations, for example, playing a role, or some virus infections that could maybe trigger it. So maybe it could also be a combination of genetics and some environmental context being at play. Well, I discovered it when I was about 28 years old, I think. That's quite common as well to discover it at that type of ages. So either at birth or also much later at 28. Or I also have a friend of my parents. He was about 50 or so when he discovered it. So he got this late onset type of diabetes.
How old are
But
you
I did
now,
have,
if you don't mind me asking?
so I'm 39 years old right now.
Yeah, I would have
So
had trouble believing you were 28.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I get that a lot. But I did have some symptoms already way earlier. I think in the end of the 90s, when I was say 18 years old, at the end of high school. I already had troubles with fatigue, car driving lessons, and I would have brain fogs and take a lot of more lessons before I would be attentive in traffic, for example. And overall, I was tired a lot and got sick a lot of times per year. And so I went to the doctors a lot, home practitioners mostly at first. And they did also do, for example, sugar test. So it was not an HbA1c test, but just a morning glucose. And I did have a sandwich before, but I think the measurements read about 8 or 9 millimoles. So that would be about 160, 170 milligrams per deciliter
Hmm.
for a young guy.
Little high.
Eating a sandwich, that's not right, and that sort of things was just overlooked. I think back then it was still normal to accept blood sugars going up to 160, 180,
Hmm.
and then you would not be diabetic, or at least not according to official rules. So that got totally overlooked. And of course, I thought, well, I ate this bread in the morning with some marmalade on it, so probably it was that. So we didn't give it other thoughts. And yeah, then years passed, and a lot of things I thought I discovered. So at some point, I thought I had celiac disease. So I stopped eating gluten. That helped a lot, for example. I think overall, I didn't eat a lot of carbs. So that maybe helped a little bit as well.
How did going gluten free, did it have any positive effects?
Oh, it certainly had positive effects. I'm not sure how, with my knowledge of today, uh, I'm not sure how it worked, because indeed you have a lot of other lectins, and also considering, actually this was before my diagnosis of diabetes as well. So
Okay.
I first had this gluten intolerance, and they are genetically also related. So
Hmm.
if you have some gene mutations so they are all related, right? These autoimmune diseases. So rheumatic diseases, gluten intolerance, and diabetes, they are very closely located on the genes. So I first had the gluten intolerance, but with that, when by starting the gluten-free diet, I also introduced a lot more carbs because, well, you typically switch to corn starches, rice starches instead of, let's say, whole wheat bread. So they are
Yeah.
all bad, but at least cornstarch is even worse. And somehow it might even be the fiber that helps somehow. So you're eating a lot of carbs, and if you're eating a lot of carbs, I think in that case, in that scenario, fibers might help sometimes to slow
True.
digestions a little bit. So it might have improved my glucose uptake. So overall that was a benefit, but of course also very bad because, well, I think about 2 years later, I was actually diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. And for me, so for a lot of people, it's difficult, I think, to recognize it at first. So they would start to pee a lot in the night and that sort of things. And then they would start to wonder, what is it? Takes a few days or a few weeks even before they go to the doctor. But for me, back then I already read about this relation between celiac disease and type 1 diabetes. So for me, it was just one click. I was peeing a lot. So next day I went to the doctor and then it went very quickly. I didn't end up with ketoacidosis in the hospital. What happens a lot with type 1 diabetes, because
Hmm.
basically that's the way that it's recognized. It just evolves into such a critical thing that people go to the hospital. But for me, well, I went to the doctor in the morning, and at first he prescribed me some metformin. Then I actually that was also just right before holidays, so I went on the train with the metformin in the bag. And then, well, 1 hour in the train ride, I got a phone call from the doctor, and he urgently suggested me to go to the hospital to check for ketoacidosis. And indeed, my sugar levels were elevated a lot. And then it also went quite quickly because I was there. We recognized it quite early, and of course they give you an infuse to hydrate your body again. Because that's what can happen with ketoacidosis as well, right? So if you enter in ketoacidosis, you basically don't have any insulin available in your body to metabolize the glucose. So your glucose levels will rise, but at the same time, it's not being absorbed by your body cells. And so your body will resort to metabolizing fats, and then you get the ketones that are rising as well. And then you have two substances in your body that that will raise the acidity of your blood, and then it can, you get a sort of feedback circle where it just gets more acidic very rapidly.
So were you in the beginning stages, or were you in ketoacidosis when you went to the hospital after the doctor contacted you?
Well, they treated me as if I were, but I think if I would have just started drinking a lot of water and taking insulin, that I would have easily survived. So it was more protocol than actual critical treatment, I think. But yeah, that's just for safety that they do that.
So at this point, though, you've got the diagnosis. How did you go? How did you get from where you were at that moment to where you are now, where you're using diet to change things for yourself?
Oh, yeah, that's a long trajectory because this is 15 years ago, and of course, so I don't know how well it compares with the US, but certainly they don't put you on a very high carb diet, but still they would suggest to eat bread like any other person has. So the idea of that you can compensate your food intake, your carbohydrate intake with insulin, you just either put extra injections or push extra button on your insulin pump, and you can eat more and you can eat that extra piece of cake. That idea is also here as well. So that's how I started in the beginning. But what also happens, type 1 diabetes is the onset of it is a gradual process. Well, maybe not in infants, because there it can maybe already be fully developed. But if you get it on a later age, then it can be very well that your pancreas is still able to produce a certain level of insulin. So in the beginning, I think probably because I was on a high carb diet, on a standard diet, let's say, I had to produce quite some insulin. And so my diagnosis of type 1 diabetes was also very easy, because my pancreas would not be able to produce sufficiently. But after diagnosis, basically I continued on a standard diet, so still eating bread and pasta and rice. Maybe I would have gone to whole grain rice, that sort of things, and that might help a little bit, but we all know that in the end you'll get the sugar spikes as well. But the first years, I could manage very well. So with taking some insulin, measuring, say, 5 times a day, my sugar levels would be between, say, 50 and 120 or so. Trying to sort of mimic your pancreas function manually with all these injections and all these disturbing factors in it is really difficult. And if you want to have still some life remaining, some quality of life, you have to accept it. And I think as long as the variations are gradual, then for at least for a type 1 diabetic, that's really good. If you stay below, say, 120, and well, nowadays I would try to stay below 100, 110. But yeah, because my pancreas was still partially working, I think for about 5, 6, 7, 8 years, maybe even. Typically, when people would ask, "Oh, it's a very difficult disease. How do you manage? I would basically tell them it's no problem. And if I want to eat more, I take some more insulin, and I still stay within range. But gradually, that deteriorate, and a lot of factors also don't help. So you, at younger age, you tend to spend a lot of more effort and time on work, and you do a lot of things, and then you don't mind your diet a lot. So even within the standard diet, there are various gradations, I think, in terms of
Sure.
quality. That's just the diet, and then there's alcohol or smoking, or on the positive side, there's a lot of exercise that might cover up the problems that are there. A lot of times I would be metabolizing all the carbohydrates that were getting into my body. But then once in a while, when you stop the exercise, you get several weeks that unexplainably your glucose control goes down. It's not always easy to pinpoint that it's where it's coming from, but that's all these factors play a role. All these variations in day-to-day living patterns can play a role. Of course, things like disease, stress can affect the amount of insulin basically that you need. And then when you need more insulin, then I have to inject also a lot more. And when the input of a system is larger, then also the errors in the system become larger. That's a concept that I learned from Dr. Bernstein. I find that's basically, it sounds so simple, but it's such an important concept when you try to treat a disease with a lot of confounding factors, a lot of uncertainties. Well, then try to at least reduce the size of inputs.
You mentioned the diabetes solution by Dr. Bernstein. I haven't had a
Yeah.
chance to look closer at that, but if you want to tell me a little bit about what you gleaned from that, because I assume that was something you were reading as you were struggling to manage being a type 1 diabetic. Obviously, it sounds like a challenge that you'd rather be able to live without, but obviously you were searching. So how did you come across the diabetes solution, and what did it help you with?
Yeah, so actually, I cannot remember, but for sure it was YouTube. After seeing the first movie of him, this guy is like 87 years old, I think. And well, he's still doing a lot of things that maybe some people of 60 years old are already not doing anymore.
Okay.
As a type 1 diabetic, that's very special because he grew up, in the first half of the last century, basically. And I think that's maybe even the time when we still had to treat type 1 diabetes with pork insulin. And we didn't have all these measurement devices. So if you were lucky, you would once in a while take a glucose measurement to see the status of your glucose control. So he lived through all that. And then I think in the 80s or so, he switched to a low carb diet. If you see the guy, he's doing really well. And
So he's been doing this for 30 plus years as a type
yes,
1
yeah,
diabetic. Okay. Low carb
yeah,
dieting is a
yeah.
big part of his solution, I should say, because I'm sure there's no one size fits all solution for everyone. But it seems like I'm noticing more and more researchers, not only in diabetes, but also in the cancer world, are starting to take a closer look at diet. I think one of the problems with our medical community, and I've talked about medical professionals sometimes in a negative light because I've had such bad experiences with them myself. But I always want to let everybody know that I don't think everybody in the medical community is only out to profit from the medicine itself and to not actually deliver services. I truly believe there's a lot of medical professionals out there who are serious about finding cures and answers for these diseases and being able to help their patients. The medical world is kind of siloed, where you've got people that are studying diabetes and you got people that are studying cancer. The people who are studying diabetes aren't thinking about what cancer researchers are looking at, and the same thing with cancer researchers aren't looking at what diabetes researchers are looking at. And lately they've been discovering that there's a little bit of a crossover. And from what I've been reading about in a book called Ravenous by Sam Apple, where he talks about the Warburg effect and how diet is becoming once again a part of the focus of cancer research, and even some of the diabetic research has crossed over. Like they've found that people that take metformin for type 2 diabetes were less likely to get cancer than those who weren't taking metformin. And they said, well, what's causing that? And that it had to do with the reduction of glucose. So, and I've been watching another researcher recently. I can't think of his name right this moment. I want to say Siddhartha. Oh, geez, I can't think of his full name, but I'll put it on the screen here so people could see it. And he was a Pulitzer Prize winner for a book he wrote back in 2010 called The Emperor of All Maladies, where he was dealing with cancer. And he is starting to really, as somebody who's obviously highly intelligent and focused on trying to get answers to these things so that he can help people have better longevity, like you're talking about with Dr. Bernstein, somebody who's going to be able to live a full life and be healthy during that time period, having that quality of life that you want to have. It's not all about just living as long as you can. If you're miserable, it's not, you may not want to live that much longer. But if you're feeling better, then longevity is certainly something you want to be able to enjoy. This particular doctor has commented specifically, Siddhartha Mukherjee. He's an oncologist and cancer historian who did not mention the Warburg effect in his book, The Emperor of All Maladies. He's now investigating how a ketogenic diet, which keeps insulin levels very low, might make drugs that block insulin signaling more potent. He is also calling for more research on diet as a therapy that might be used in concert with cancer drugs. In his own lab at Columbia University, he's working with Cantley's Weill Cornell lab to test whether drugs that block PI3K signaling might be more effective against cancer with a diet that lowers glucose and insulin levels. And careful scientific examination of diet as medicine is now long overdue in oncology, as it is in most fields of medicine, he said. So it's interesting to see that prominent researchers, somebody like Dr. Mukherjee, is really starting to take an interest in diet. And it sounds like Dr. Bernstein that you mentioned is using that same approach. I always like to remind everybody, I'm learning about this stuff as I go. I mean, most of what I've experienced has just been miraculous going to a carnivore way of eating. It behooves me, now that I have so many people watching and learning from my experience, to research these things so that I can kind of bring it to the forefront. Because I know when I've watched some videos with Dr. Mukherjee, and boy, you can get lost in the weeds with some of their discussion on all the medical stuff, and you just start to, I don't know what they're talking about anymore. But it seems to come down to a problem related with too much sugar consumption in general in our average diets. And I'm wondering if that's, was that your experience, or is that where it led you? What did Dr. Bernstein talk about?
Yeah, so the main reason is still the idea of reducing so in a way he looks at it as if it's system theories, right? So his main approach, his main idea behind it, I think, is still to have as small as possible input to reduce also the errors. Basically, yeah, so I see it a bit like this. Your body is a sponge, and the speed at which it absorbs things, that's highly variable. So it's difficult to predict. So you're going to put sugar in the sponge, you're going to put insulin in the sponge, and then there are a lot of surrounding factors like temperature, humidity, let's say, of the sponge, and also types of insulin. So you can put different types of insulin in the sponge that get absorbed faster or more slowly, and the same holds true for the food, of course. And one of the main ideas of Dr. Bernstein is that in the high carb approach, you will get a very steep spike of your glucose entering your body, the carbohydrates, and you would have to compensate that with, I don't know how long those exist, but the ultra rapid insulins, they say that they exist for a few decades now, but basically you have to compensate with those, and you have to get two things right. So you have to get the peak level right of the insulin to match directly with the carbohydrates. And now I'm going to simplify it a little bit, I think, because I also don't know all the mechanisms behind it. But I guess effectively you have to match the areas under the curves. So those have to match, and then the location of the peaks and the levels of the peak have to be matching. And of course, that is way too difficult to determine, because you don't know how fast the insulin is actually being absorbed by the body, because that depends on all these factors. And also you don't know, say that you're eating an apple, then you don't know if it has, say, 10% carbs or 15% carbs. Was it a very ripe apple or not? That sort of things. Alternatively, you would eat a lot of proteins and no carbs, and then you would have typical insulin response of proteins and also the absorption response that is a much less steeper hill and also much lower. Well, you get two hills like this, and maybe there's a small gap in between that you made a mistake, but that small gap or the small bump in it, that's effectively not going to do much with your glucose levels.
I
So
understand. When you're saying that if you have to deal with big spikes, it's harder to determine how much insulin you need to handle that. So you might go too
yeah,
much, you might go too little, and either way that's not going to be good. But if it's not a huge spike, then you can manage it with smaller amounts and better keep on a stable level as opposed to having
yeah,
those highs and lows that you don't want. Gotcha.
yeah. And then with those mildly sloped hills, you would get a small dent or a small bump on top if you make a mistake. So say instead of 100, your glucose becomes 105.
Yeah.
So that could happen in a natural person, because if you start
Sure.
intense exercise, your glucose will shortly peak. If you do exercise for a long time, it will drop a little bit, or if you don't eat for a long time, that sort of things. But if you follow this high carb approach with ultra rapid insulin, these dents or these bumps, they will be either a peak and then later on a very big trough, for example. And that trough, that could be severe hypoglycemia.
Yeah.
And then you get what people always refer to as the big roller coaster.
Mm-hmm.
And that has, well, I can tell you, I experienced that in the last, say, 3 to 4 years, particularly. That has really a detrimental effect on your daily life, because mentally you cannot cope with it, because, well, there's the idea that you're putting a lot of effort in it, trying to do things right, and you see still bad results. So that's already very tough to deal with, because it's like there's this guy up there that is just trying to think of some way to derail things. Every time you can think of a different reason why something is not working. Then you think you have thought of every reason behind glucose instabilities and how to deal with it, and then there will pop up a new one. Just a difficult aspect of the disease to deal with. But apart from that, there is the practical aspect. If, for example, in the morning I would eat my slices of bread or a plate of oatmeal, and I would go to work, that's basically the worst combination that you could get. So you have your breakfast, you would have an insulin spike, then there is something that is called the dawn phenomenon. So in the morning, your body is already releasing a lot of glycogen in the blood to raise your blood glucose. So you need a lot of insulin to compensate for that. Then I'm going to bike to work.
Mm.
So then, well, basically after breakfast, I'm putting my body in a really alert state, waking my body up. So I'm exacerbating this effect. Then I arrive at work, and then I'm going to sit still in a chair behind the computer screen.
Okay.
And then all this glycogen and glucose comes into the system. Your body is suddenly quiet, so that's the reason why you would need even more insulin, because, well, if you're sitting still, your insulin sensitivity reduces. And so you would basically end up, say you start at work at 9, and at 10 o'clock, the continuous glucose meter would start to alarm that the blood sugar levels are way too high. And then if it's really too high, you would have to take a break. And luckily, I could do that at my work, and have a break and do a brisk walk before lunch. So most people would do this during lunch. They would have a walk with some sandwiches during lunch and then continue with work again. But like this, you have a very dysregulated working schedule, basically. There's always the diabetes that can disrupt your daily schedule. That's
Okay.
that's a
Well,
practical
obviously, it
aspect.
sounds like a less than optimal situation to have to deal with. How have you used a carnivore way of eating, and how long have you been doing that? Also, how has that changed your approach to treating your type 1 diabetes? And also, were you doing all this competitive style exercise all along, or was it more just for transportation purposes, like you mentioned, riding your bike to work and things like that prior to this, or did you start to become more active as a result of switching to the carnivore way of eating?
Yeah, so I became active already before. So I think up to 2 years ago, main reason to do sports was actually commuting to work indeed. And I would have the occasional walk, but actually I would not sport that much. And also resistance exercise is something I didn't do. That's something that really started with carnivore diet. But I started biking about 1.5 years ago. So serious road cycling and doing, say, at least 100 and at some point 300, or at rare occasions 500 kilometers a week. But that was about 1.5 years ago. And I basically was still on the standard diet. And when you are on standard diet and you start exercising like this, you start to do endurance exercise. That means that you're going to extend your standard diet. So you're just going to eat more bread when you're on the bike. You're going to drink the Coke. So I'm not going to drink Diet Coke when I'm on the bike. And the nice thing, but also the dangerous thing about it is that on the bike, you can eat all this and don't notice it in your blood glucose levels, basically. So I could drink half a liter of Coke, maybe take a little bit of extra insulin, but also often not. And it would not show up on the glucose meters. Because when the machine is rolling, that basically there is so little insulin required. That holds true for healthy people, but also for type 1 diabetes. And for me, that's very practical, of course, because basically that's the main reason why I like cycling so much. Because basically that's what I would say people is that on the bike, the type 1 diabetes is not there.
So
And
just
what,
having the intense exercise alone with a standard diet
yeah,
was also helping your overall progress in dealing with type 1 diabetes.
on the bike it did. Um, and that's also a reason why I liked cycling alone a lot, because I would be able to continue cycling. But if I would be cycling in a group, then there is always these obligatory moments of drinking a coffee with a piece of cake. That in the Netherlands, that's the basic cyclist diet. So if you go to a cafe, then you don't have to tell what you're going to eat. You take a coffee and an apple cake.
Yeah.
And that's when the type 1 diabetes immediately shows up again. Because if I know that I have to stop for biking, from biking for, say, half an hour, then my glucose level can be at 50, 60. But then typically after exercise, you also get a high peak. So even if you don't eat, you get a high peak in glucose, because I think it's your liver that is releasing glucose again,
Yes.
or glycogen, to basically restore the glycogen levels of your muscles again. And that process starts very quickly. So if I'm sitting down at a cafe, then my glucose levels go to 180, 200, 220 immediately, unless I take insulin for it. But if I take insulin for it, I risk to go low
Right.
after 1.5 hours when we go back on the bike again. So that
Right.
was all very complicated. That's the immediate effect, but also if there is a 1 week of no cycling, let's say, then typically you continue to eat as if you are going to cycle again. So in your mind, you don't realize that you need less food. And so these carbohydrates are going to have a severe impact. And what I basically noticed it was end of summer last year, the cycling stopped. And I simply noticed I was gaining weight, and it was not muscle weight. It was really because I have this biometric scale at home. It was just fat, and
Mm.
also I was taking more insulin, and that's a typical thing in insulin treatment anyway. If you treat with insulin, then you have the risk that you start to need more insulin and that you build up a type 2 effect, basically. Yeah, occasionally I would have had these moments that basically out of anger, I would throw away all the bread and all the carbohydrate stuff in the house, put
No
it in
more
the trash bin,
stroopwafels
and
for you.
yeah. Well, those I didn't eat anyway, but because that even the doctors here, they don't recommend that. But yeah, basically every time that I came across this problem, I basically realized what was the solution: to ditch all the carbs. But I didn't realize it was a true solution until I read this Dr. Bernstein diabetes solution. And that's where it started. So I went on a ketogenic diet, basically. I think I also,
This
via
was just
YouTube
after
and
last
Dr.
summer?
Bernstein. Yes. So September, October. That's when I also had a lot of symptoms related to the kidney and the bladder. So I had a lot of research done. And when you are type 1 diabetic, you start to worry about these things, of course. If you have kidney symptoms, or if you have neuropathy symptoms, which I also thought I had, then you start to worry a lot that there is a lot more happening in your body because of the type 1 diabetes. But in the end, they didn't find anything. So that was fortunate, but it made me worry enough to really change course and go for a low carb approach.
So are you
And
still
that was
doing a ketogenic diet, or are you doing more of a carnivore diet now?
right now. I'm fully carnivore, and let's say 90% lion diet. So I do eat fish, and occasionally, well, eggs I do eat sometimes,
Yeah.
and
So
very
tell me
little
about
bacon. But
that progression from keto and how that affected your health situation as a type 1 diabetic and as an endurance athlete, and then that progression to a carnivore, more carnivore heavy way of eating, and then eventually to more ruminant animals, and how those changes, what you've been experiencing them, because you've been doing this for about 11 months now since that main change. What's it
yeah.
done for you?
A lot, and I'm surprised about all these things that get mentioned on YouTube, and a lot of things I recognize myself as well. But I started on a ketogenic diet, and by watching videos like from those doctors like Stan Ekberg and Dr. Berg. So I actually started on the healthy keto diet.
Mm-hmm.
So by increasing a lot my vegetable intake, and in a way that's fortunate, because that made me learn also a lot of things about oxalates. So one thing was that it helped a lot with my glucose control. So that at first. So it was big improvement. So without putting too much thinking and too much measuring of my carb intake and all these things, so what happens normally, you would be running behind. Your glucose meter also has a delay of say 5 to 10 or 15 minutes. So you're always running behind the facts. And if then there is a lot of carbohydrates, to compensate after a delay means basically that you are too late. But with this ketogenic approach, if I see that my glucose is creeping up a little bit, I will just put some extra insulin in it, and I'm fine. So that's helped a lot. Basically, I stay within the lines.
So a
But
ketogenic diet helped you stabilize because you were cutting
yeah,
out
yeah,
things like bread and complex carbohydrates and sugar.
yeah,
So you were
yeah.
getting rid
So
of a lot of that processed food. You were eating more natural things, whether it was vegetables or meat or a combination thereof. So that alone was helping you have some more stability.
yeah, and I think also Dr. Bernstein, he actually does eat some vegetables. So if you're talking just about the type 1 diabetes aspect, I think on itself I would say going for a keto-4 approach would be sufficient to stabilize your glucose level.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
I tell people all the time, there's not necessarily one solution that's going to fit everybody's current issues. And my issue was kind of unique to other people's. Or well, I mean, I'm finding out there's more and more people out there who are experiencing exactly what I was experiencing, saying, why is this pain in my gut that doesn't seem to go away and just keeps getting worse, and it's causing constipation. It's causing so much pain that I would wind up in the hospital, waking up after an ambulance ride there because I was screaming in pain so much that I actually lost consciousness. And then I awaken and I'm in a hospital room because they've already put me through the ER and everything, and they haven't been able to figure out what's wrong with me. And then they come and tell me, what do you want us to do? There's nothing wrong with you. You're just complaining and there's nothing there. So, lion diet was what worked for me because I was at the end of my rope. I mean, I think for a lot of people, being able to make a change to something like lion diet is going to take that extreme pressure, external pressure, and not getting any answers from the community that you count on to give you those answers, that medical community. And when they don't have those answers, you turn to what you can. And I'm just thankful that I found the right thing. I mean, I, as a spiritual person, I just say, thank you, Lord, for bringing me to this solution, to bringing this person into my life who was able to introduce it to me. And I'm thankful to be able to have been that influence for others. But I try to remind everybody, this isn't necessarily what you need. I mean, if you're looking for, let's say you just want to lose some weight because you realize the benefits overall health of getting excess fat off of your body, is going to certainly be better for your health. And after all we went through in the past 3 years with the pandemic, a lot of people are looking at, hey, I've gained more weight than I need to have, and it's making me more susceptible to possibly the virus. And then, as I've been doing more research, obviously diabetes has always been on the radar of people who have extra weight. And now they're taking a closer look at cancer research for diet like that. Losing weight is obviously going to be beneficial for anybody's health. So lion diet is certainly going to allow you to do that. But it's a bit extreme for most people to jump into something like
Yeah,
that.
it depends on where you're coming from. And so for you as well, I understand. And for me, the decision is very easy because I had such drastic problems that I had to deal with.
Yeah.
And the choice is easy. Well, I'm going to restrict my diet. Well, I think in advance that I'm going to restrict my life a lot by eating like this. But nowadays, I don't even think it's like that because
Right.
it's no problem to eat like this. I'm very happy. I enjoy my meals.
Yeah.
But making such a radical change in lifestyle is so easy because basically, well, that sounds a bit extreme to say that I had no life before, but it would happen that if I like sporting a lot as well. So also when I started cycling, I still had this diabetes interfering with it. So sometimes I would have a day like, now I want to go cycling for half a day. But then my glucose levels were so dysregulated that I had to cancel my cycling trip, for example. So you're thinking in your mind, like, I'm doing something as simple as going on a bike ride, and I'm not able to plan it. So
Yeah.
and you look out of the window and you see all these people running and jogging and cycling every day, and you think, why can't I do that?
Yeah.
And such a simple thing. So then that makes a choice making of changing your diet like this so easy because
Well, a lot of people, I think they want to focus on, I want the freedom to eat whatever I want to eat and still do what I would like to be able to do, but my body just can't do it. And they're not putting the blame on the food, and they're not realizing that there's actually more freedom sometimes in restricting what you eat to what is
yeah,
profitable for your body, and then the freedom of living that life that comes from that is so much better than the short-term benefits of what you're getting from, say, a comfort food indulgence. That they start, like you're saying, you start to realize, now I'm experiencing freedom even though my diet is restricted.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
not
I
it's
remember
not
your
actually
movie that
restrictive to your life.
that was very. I really enjoyed that movie a lot. That you were eating with your family, I think, and they all had some nice plates in the restaurant, and you didn't have anything. But
Yeah.
that feeling is really. It's also a good feeling indeed that you don't need to have that. So I had that idea last time as well. That was the birthday of my son, and I'm not of the opinion that once a year you should eat that piece of cake because.
Right.
So my son, luckily he doesn't care about this, so he finds it perfectly fine if I don't join with the cake. But I also think I'm not sure if it's always like this, but uh, I suspect that it's sometimes also an excuse for people to say like, yes,
Sure.
I have to eat that piece of cake.
Sure it is.
And but the feeling that you get that you don't need it, you don't, well, you don't need it, you don't even want it. That's well, I like that feeling indeed,
Yeah.
that feeling of freedom.
Sometimes the things we desire actually enslave us, and I think when you finally feel like, wow, I don't need to respond the way everybody else does to sugary things and treats and whatever we call treats, because ultimately they're a short-term boost in, say, dopamine, makes you feel good for just a moment, but then it brings you back down even lower afterward. So it actually is not beneficial, but we make those excuses because sometimes life is full of tragedy and difficulty and challenges, and no matter who you are, I don't care how happy you look on the outside, you're dealing with something. Everybody's dealing with something. And it's easy for us to convince ourselves that I deserve this. I deserve this piece of cake or this piece of pie. But when you see it from a different perspective, saying I deserve something that's going to actually give me a setback starts to become a reality, and then you're able to break free from that having a dominance over you, and that's where that freedom is found. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the feeling. I mean, in the past I smoked as well, so I had a few years that I really smoked a lot of cigarettes. It's
Yeah.
already a long time ago, but then I stopped. Then after say 5 6 years, I went back on cigars. So I would not smoke a lot of them, but they were there as a constant. So
Yeah,
basically,
I
that's
understand the appeal.
addiction.
I think a lot of people can relate to exactly what you're talking about. Like they want to do something healthier, but there's that pull inside of us that it makes me feel better for a moment, and it's
Yeah.
hard to get away from those things. You were saying your ride was supposed to help collect funding to support cancer research at
Also, yeah,
Erasmus
yeah, sure.
MC. My mistake.
Yeah, no. So that's true, and yeah. So we talked a lot, and I think you talked about it in a few movies as well. I've seen at least one of them, but we talked about the metabolic aspect of cancer. I think it's also really good to still keep investing on all other aspects. And if you're unlucky to have cancer, then a lot of times you would still have to do nowadays to still have to do chemotherapy, for example, or other
Yeah.
things. Makes sense to combine it with good diet, but yeah, a lot of other research I think is
Yeah.
good that still has to be done. So we have to not be single-minded about only
Right.
using diet. So what they are doing at Erasmus right now, and that's also what we are doing the bike ride for, is testing whether certain blood markers can be useful to exclude the need of chemotherapy. Yeah? So in this specific case, and yeah, that's just amazing, by the way, that cancer research. So we are now collecting about, I think, 700,000 euros. Cancer research is so expensive, but also so useful. But what they are going to do from this money now is to check for certain blood markers if they are useful in excluding the need of chemotherapy. Yeah? So I think in this case it's colorectal cancer. Then typically, once it has been removed, there is about 10 or 20% chance that you need second chemotherapy after some time, after a year or so. And some countries, and they typically tend to do that in the southern countries of Europe, where they are a little bit more, don't take any risk. And in the northern countries, they take less, they take a little bit more risk, and they say like, we don't do chemotherapy unless it's really indicated that it's necessary. So the approach in the south is to always do chemotherapy a second time, and in the north to not do it unless we at some point get symptoms again.
Yeah. Well,
And
it's
that's
rough on the body.
very, yes,
It's
yes,
rough.
but it's a very difficult decision to make how to approach this. And if we can ease it up with some blood markers to exclude those 80% or even 50%, let's say, of those unnecessary chemotherapies, that's just already a big gain. Just funny to see that on itself, this research sounds totally uninspiring, but if you think about what it does and what the effect of it
I'm
is.
inspired by anything that investigates other aspects of it because, pretty much since genetic research started to become the new thing in the 1960s, that's all they've put their energy, all their eggs are in the basket of genetic research to develop drugs to target cancer specifically. And what they've been finding, and this is, according to what I've learned from listening to Dr. Mukherjee, is that as soon as they find the Achilles heel of a particular type of cancer, and he put it this way, he said it's like we fire an arrow into that Achilles heel to kill the cancer, and the cancer has built into it the ability just to take that arrow out and throw it away and keep going like it was going. And they're mystified by this in the 2010s. And it's only in these past, say, 13 years that he started to take a dual approach of using what they've learned from genetic research and the medicines they've come up with that and applying that along with proper diet, which he seems to see as a ketogenic diet being the best way because they've related the insulin as being kind of the soil that the cells are in that causes it to be susceptible to that rapid production that cells go through when they become cancerous because they start consuming glucose in mass amounts. And this is a lot of detail from the book I mentioned earlier, Ravenous by Sam Apple. So I found the book to be very interesting, but it really didn't get into the meat and potatoes of cancer research and the recent changes until the end of the book. And that was when I learned about Dr. Mukherjee, and then I started looking him up, and he's all over YouTube. There. Oh, you're already...
I still have to get there. But I found it, sometimes it's quite difficult book already, so when it goes into some details. So
yeah, because he focuses a lot on the history and what went on around because, Dr. Warburg was... living in Nazi Germany at the time, and he was half Jewish, so that kind of caused a problem for him. I mean, you can imagine if you've done any research on that time period that it would definitely create some difficult barriers to deal with and to live in that environment. It also kind of shows later on why his research was later ignored by a lot of researchers because of that problem they had processing him surviving in that situation and not taking a more firm stance against what he was involved in. I don't think anybody could say Dr. Warburg was the greatest person in the world, but his research was indicating that the problem was lying somewhere in the sugar realm. He didn't really pick up on the insulin realm. This is something that you find out later. It's doctors more recently are realizing it's the insulin that becomes that fertile soil in your body for cancer to thrive, not necessarily to form, because obviously carcinogens and other external factors and even genetic factors can trigger cancer to begin. But they're finding that when they're not consuming a lot of sugar and there's a lot less insulin in the body, that it's not able to thrive as well. So that's where the interesting side comes in as far as people who are looking at this way of eating.
That you mention it because that's a thing that you would typically not come across either as a non-diabetic person. But there is this type of long-acting insulin. I won't mention the name, but there's a certain one where there has been some suggestions that it could be cancerogenous, for example. I think insulin is also, maybe just because of the fact it's an anabolic hormone, right? That it's, I can imagine for that reason already that it can trigger the growth of cancer cells, or that at least help it. So I'm interested in reading that part of the book as well. And
when you get into like chapters 19, 20, and 21, it really starts to delve deeper into all of that. You'll find out about how cancer cells have a lot of insulin receptors, and they start creating even more as they become cancerous because it allows them to thrive. And normal, and this is the best I've been able to, I've had to go over it and over it and over it to really soak some of this in. But ultimately, a cell will normally realize that something's wrong and it'll instruct itself to starve itself to death, but so that it'll stop being a problem for the rest of the body. But once it turns cancerous, it's like that those brakes that say stop consuming are broken, and it's just in high gear, and it's going to continue to consume and consume, which gives it the materials it needs to multiply, and as it multiplies it spreads. And it's just, I guess, being in the Netherlands, you might be familiar with this. Nitrogen is obviously extremely important for crop growth. And when you start to reduce the amount of nitrogen you're using, you start to reduce the amount of growth of those crops. Well, that's making the soil for the land ready for what those crops need to thrive. And it's kind of the same concept that I'm starting to pick up on when it comes to insulin in the blood, and how sugar specifically, the reason why we've seen from the 1800s to now, where it was the average of around 1 in 3 people were dying from cancer at the end of the 19th century, to now you have 1 in 3 people dying. 1 in 1,500 people then, 1 in 3 people now dying from cancer. That's a huge difference. And the other research that they point out is that when they start looking at indigenous cultures, that they don't have this change. People who are eating a more diet that was not changed by processed foods and all of the other things that we do, whether it's crossbreeding or genetic manipulation that we do to the food now. But this started long before we started using genetic manipulation to change our food, and the key ingredient seems to have been the overconsumption of sugar. Because I know there's some numbers that reflect the average American at the end of the 19th century was eating about 3 pounds of sugar a year. Well, the average American today is eating about 150 pounds of sugar a year. That is a huge difference, and that difference is very similar to the increase in cancer. Now, that correlation doesn't necessarily mean that one equals the other, but as you start to look at the Warburg effect and how the cells are consuming glucose, and they're getting that glucose from sugar in the diet, which is causing insulin levels to rise too, making that soil so fertile, that they're starting to put some of those things together, and they're hopefully going to be able to use diet and medicine to help people who already have cancer. And I'm kind of thinking too that if you're concerned about cancer, that maybe a ketogenic diet or a carnivore diet might help keep your body from being so accessible to cancer taking root.
Yeah, and I think even for a lot of people, going half ketogenic would already be a big improvement. So stay with below 100 grams of carbs today.
Yeah.
That would be already, I guess, if you add up all the benefit of society and all the reduced costs of healthcare, already by doing such a thing, that would be a big improvement.
Well, is there anything else you'd like to add?
A lot probably, but I find it very interesting, and I like the aspect that you dive into some subjects like this. So you could say like, oh, now I'm on carnivore diet and everything is all right, and not care about anything, but it's interesting to investigate and look around.
Yeah, well, if it helps other people to avoid certain health issues or to deal with certain health issues, that's just what I've been noticing has been the overall benefit. And I have to be careful in a place like YouTube because they're a bit more sensitive to what people can say, and I think that can be counterproductive. It would almost be like saying that if they don't agree with something like the book Ravenous talks about, then we're just going to take that book off the shelf. And when we have that kind of censorship, we're not going to get to the answers because we're going to stay locked into a type of thinking that isn't going to explore other avenues. So at the same time,
maybe that's a nice one to mention. That I'm also reading things like this of Ben Bikman, for example. It's also about insulin, why we get sick. That's I wanted to mention them a moment ago, and that's one thing as a type 1 diabetic that I'm worried a bit about still. That insulin is by many people still considered as simply a hormone to reduce the glucose level of your blood. And but we know now that it's doing so much more with cancer and all kinds of other health aspects. So yeah, one thing I'm worried about still is that I'm now treating my type 1 diabetes with insulin injections, just only looking at glucose. So when my glucose goes up, I put insulin in my body. But knowing that it does so much more, that cannot be the perfect treatment. So
Yeah.
there has to be done a lot more research on
Right.
the
Well, I'm
effects of
definitely
insulin.
not saying that I've got all the answers on it. I just know that it's good to see that they're looking at something beyond finding a target pill. Like they want to have a magic bullet that's just going to take cancer out and call it, and label it, put it in a bottle and sell it to you. That's kind of what their focus is. But I don't think that approach is going to get us to the final answer. It may be a part of the final answer, but it appears that diet has a tremendous amount to do with that, and sugar consumption seems to be a very high corollary to the increased amount of cancer across the board in civilized societies. I know they got your website here. I see. I brought it up earlier. That
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, yeah.
Tour for Life.
But yeah, people can look there. But I'm also really tempted now. I realize I start to forget things about all the past months about the carnivore diet, and already to not forget these things, I'm really tempted to start to make my movies on YouTube as well. But apart from the
Well, I'll be sure to
description,
put
so
a link for your Tour for Life page on here if anybody wants to
okay,
try to help
thanks.
support what you're doing to help cancer research. I guess we'll finish it here.
I enjoyed it very much. It's as if we are in a living room having a nice chat. So that's really nice. Yeah, no, same here. Thanks.
If we pay extra, could we maybe get some grease or fat?